with us tonight is Dr. Oliver Hartwich, Chief Economist for the Policy Exchange think tank, and Bob Roberts, the political editor of the Daily Mirror. Very good evening to both of you. Let's get straight into question one, and indeed the first few questions concentrate on Northern Rock. The programme Question Time was of course recorded in Newcastle upon Tyne. Difficult issue, and the first question specifically was, has the government failed in its handling of Northern Rock? Well, here's the Shadow Secretary of State for Business, Alan Duncan.
Yes, I think it has. I think after 5 months there is not a solution that is going to be permanent and convincing. I mean, I can accept it was a very, very difficult decision in government, but I think the government have rather made a mess of it. They turned down an approach from Lloyd's TSB. I mean, all of us across all parties wanted to protect depositors. That's good, I think. They then tried for a private sale because they couldn't bear the thought of having to nationalise something. Now they've had to go about nationalising it. Our view has always been that, yes, protect the depositors, but have a bank-led reconstruction, because nationalisation, I think, is not the solution.
Well, Alan Duncan there. Let's get straight into your questions and responses to that debate. Tony Dowling from Gateshead. Oliver, this is to you. The government has not failed Northern Rock, the market has.
Well, I think the government has failed Northern Rock, because if you look at how the government has handled this whole affair, you will see that they had information about 4 weeks before the run on the bank happened that something was wrong with Northern Rock, and they didn't act. They let 4 weeks pass, and when it actually came to it, it took another 4 days for the government to decide what to do about the bank run. So I think the handling that the government has shown of this whole affair was definitely not up to standard.
Derek from Norfolk says the Board of Directors failed, not the government.
Well, clearly the Board of Directors have taken some risky decisions about Northern Rock's business model, which has now shown to be unsustainable. But clearly the government's handling of the whole affair wasn't really up to standard either.
Bob, what do you think?
I think Derek is right and Oliver's wrong, I'm afraid. It was the Board of Directors which had the risky business model. It was them who went on a crazy path of lending too much money. The government had to get involved because the banking system was under threat. They had to get involved because to protect the depositors. Now they're having to get involved to protect the taxpayers. They were sold a difficult path. They've handled it as well as they could.
There's a common thread on the political side of this in a lot of the messages we're seeing. Let me give you a taste of it. Kaz from Rochford. How do they find the money for Northern Rock, but there's none for hospitals, schools or roads? Oliver?
Well, that's precisely the point. We have now put about 110 billion on the government's books now for Northern Rock. And the question is really, is that money justified to save a bank, which probably doesn't really pose any risk?
Of course, the money may not be spent. I mean, it's a guarantee.
Which is true, but we have already given 25 billion in loans to Northern Rock. So the question is really whether Northern Rock, in the current state, in the current circumstances, really poses a threat to the UK's economic stability. I don't think it does anymore. It was a threat when there were queues in front of the bank branches.
OK, Bob, I mean, there are quite a few of our viewers who are questioning the sort of allegiance which this government has to the northeast of England specifically. Perhaps that was greater under Tony Blair, who of course was a northeast MP, but a great deal of the cabinet was. Take, for example, Mick from Devon. If the bank had been called Southern Rock, this government would have just let it go under.
No, I'm afraid that's a bit of sort of anti-southern bias or anti-northern bias. The banking system in general was under threat when the run on the bank was going on. It may have the name Northern Rock, but if that had gone under, it could have affected a lot of other institutions.
All right, well, following that on, Andy from Liverpool says if Northern Rock was based in the square mile, then I doubt very much it would have had as much government assistance.
I'm afraid that's also politically naive. Because the North East is a Labour heartland, the Labour government could almost afford not to do it, because those people are still going to vote Labour. It is not a sensitive marginal seat area, it is a solid Labour area.
Oliver?
Probably agree with that. It was really important to stop the panic spreading to other UK financial institutions, so the government had no other choice really at that stage to stop it.
Wendy Fox in Swindon says, why didn't Equitable Life get rescued when in trouble? Oliver?
Well, simply for the reason because there were no queues in front of Equitable Life.
Yeah, it's an interesting question, isn't it?
Well, it's probably also how the media handled the whole story, because in those 4 days when there were the queues in front of the bank branches, everybody thought that this bank was close to collapsing, and the whole thing was going to spread to other banks. So there was a political urgency about the whole thing, which probably wasn't there in the same category with Equitable Life.
I know there was another similar question I had on a similar line, which when I find, I'll mention it because it was quite an interesting one. I've just lost it at the moment. Let's just look at the issue of the shareholders, which is sort of linked into this first question about whether the government has failed, because a lot of some of the anger and question time was coming specifically from people who own shares. Sue in Newport, the shareholders gambled their money when they bought the shares, win and lose. That's how it goes, Bob.
Yeah, it's a difficult thing to say in front of an audience in Newcastle, let's be fair about that. But if you invest in shares, we all know the small print, we all know what it says, and I'm afraid they lost.
I mean, there are lots like John from Leeds. I mean, Oliver, I'll get you to pick up on this, but similar, the shareholders were happy to take the profits, why not stand the losses, and so on.
Yes, I mean, it's one group of people we shouldn't feel sorry for. It's the shareholders, because they are in effect speculators, and if you speculate, sometimes you win, sometimes you lose.
Oliver?
I do completely agree. We have to see one thing, though. There were people who didn't speculate in Northern Rock bonds, and these are the taxpayers, and they now are asked to foot the bill for that.
OK, I mean, TOG from Manchester, why should taxpayers give a hoot about the poor shareholders shut the bank? But OK, we've answered that. I mean, nationalisation, which of course also extends from this and the government's handling, again is a common thread through our questions here. Let's take Chris from Stevenage. I'm a taxpayer, but I bet I don't see a penny even if Northern Rock do make a profit. Oliver?
There is a risk, obviously, because nobody knows how the housing market is going to develop in the next 2 or 3 years. The government has sold us the nationalisation as a temporary measure. Nobody can really define what temporary means in these circumstances. The government certainly can't predict what's going to happen in the next 2 or 3 years, and therefore there is a risk that there will be a big default.
Similarly, nationalisation did not work in the 70s. I don't think it's got much better in the last 30 years. David from London. Bob?
Well, the history of nationalisation is checkered. I mean, there was the nationalisation of Rolls-Royce in the 70s. That was taken over by the government. It was then sold on. It is now a profitable and successful company.
OK, so, go on, give us a few more.
Well, as I say, checkered is a fair one. But there's none of us are going to sit around here and going to pretend that Northern Rock is going to make a profit and we're all going to come out richer. But of the losses we could have suffered, this might be the way to minimise them.
And some of our viewers are taking this even slightly further about the whole sort of free market concept. I mean, Merv from Birmingham, we hear a lot of rubbish about the free market, but whenever it fails, taxpayers pay the bills. Oliver?
It certainly seems this way in current circumstances. And the thing is, really, it's not the government's business to take over failing companies, because otherwise, why just Northern Rock? We have about 10,000 business insolvencies every year. Should the government take them all on their books and try to restructure them? It's not the task of government really to intervene and spend taxpayers' money on that.
But specifically on this, it's a sort of, well, let me put Den from Essex. This serves to illustrate that the free marketeers have no faith in what they actually believe in.
Well, I do have faith in the free market. It seems the government doesn't have any.
But the taxpayer bails you out if it fails, is what these people are saying.
Well, if the taxpayer bails you out, I'm sorry, it's not a free market.
Private company, private issue, the government shouldn't have got involved. They didn't help Rover, Kev from the Isle of Wight, Bob.
Yeah, but the government...
That's the one I meant to ask before. That's interesting.
It's not a philosophical debate. It's not a philosophy that you believe in a free market, you don't believe in a free market, and therefore you apply your principles in a black and white fashion. Government is a practical matter about saving jobs, protecting depositors, protecting the economy.
Is this going to save jobs?
It's going to help save those jobs, which if it had gone under, there'd be none of those 6,000 jobs left.
Go on, Oliver. What's your bet on the jobs, by the way, Oliver? Because, I mean, it's a sort of centre-right think tank you're in. I think one of your specialities is actually economic competitiveness, isn't it? Where do you think the jobs are likely to end up?
Well, it's probably true what Vince Cable said in the discussion, that Northern Rock will have to shrink over time because the business model wasn't sustainable. It was a business model that worked very well.
By how much? It's what, 6,000 now? What will it come down to? Half?
It's very difficult to predict because the government doesn't even open Northern Rock's books, not even to Parliament.
OK, all right. Let's move on to, I mean, we're staying within Northern Rock. Actually, I've just been given the statistics for tonight, which are always quite interesting. And the numbers overall, there are fewer messages, emails and texts than we normally have. It's 1,877, which is, I mean, that's about half, I think, of what we had last week. But that said, the number on Northern Rock is huge. It's a massive proportion of that, 1,100 on Northern Rock. Of course, Northern Rock actually dominated the evening, so I suppose perhaps that's not surprising. But 1,100 there on Northern Rock itself. An average for a subject is usually round about sort of 500, 600, 700. OK, let's look at the second part of this. Now, this is specifically to what extent was the fate of Northern Rock tied to that of Gordon Brown? Well, here is Deputy Leader of the Liberal Democrats, Vince Cable.
It is, because he's been backseat driving the whole operation. I mean, Alistair Darling is the front man and he's been driving it. But the problem is we don't yet know whether the Northern Rock operation is going to turn out to be a relative success for this region and for the country getting its money back, or whether it's going to be a disastrous failure. Okay. Time will tell.
OK, let's have a look at this then. Too little, too late. Mervyn King warned about the approaching credit crunch months before it happened, but no one at the Treasury listened. Tom from Essex. Bob.
I think they were listening. I think that we've seen the example, that the illustration they have been listening over the last 6 months. Whatever else you can accuse Gordon Brown of, inaction on this matter is not one of them. I mean, he's been banging on about the credit crunch for as long as he's been Prime Minister.
Plenty of our viewers are challenging that. Gordon Brown, Alison from Preston, Gordon Brown needs to stop hiding in the wings and take centre stage on this issue. I mean, that's a reference to pushing Alistair Darling forward, isn't it?
Well, let's be fair, Alistair Darling is the Chancellor. If he hadn't at least stood side by side with Alistair Darling, which is what he actually done in his last 3 press conferences every time this comes up, he would be the control freak allegations would be levelled against him. No, I mean, I think for all his other faults, Gordon Brown has been on top of the fact there's been a problem coming. Other people may not have listened, but he's been talking about it ever since he's been Prime Minister.
Bill from Warrington. Brown inherited a sound economic base from Kane Clark and wasted it.
Well, 10 years of growth. I mean, let's be fair to the Tories under John Major, and going all the way back to Black Wednesday. That did change their economic policy, which gave us the proceeds of growth. But saying he's wasted it, he's kept it going.
I mean, Oliver, it is an interesting question to what extent this government is damaged or not by Northern Rock.
Well, I think we have to see that Alistair Darling has only been in his job for a bit more than half a year, so I think it's quite unfair to just blame it entirely on him, because we have to see that the structures by which we regulated our banks were set in place by Gordon Brown. We have a strange split between the FSA, the Bank of England and the Treasury in controlling our banking sector, and that was really an invention of Gordon Brown as Chancellor of the Exchequer at the time, and he's still First Lord of the Treasury.
OK, there's quite an interesting one here. DH from Northampton. Will staff at Northern Rock have their pay rises limited to 2%? I mean, it's actually, can you think about it, with the government, if it's their employees?
Well, you would think so, but I would make a very sound bet that the staff of Northern Rock will be very glad to get any pay rise at all this year. Exactly. I suspect they'll be lucky to sort of they'll be happy to have their salaries and have their jobs.
Exactly, hanging on to jobs uppermost in their minds. OK, all right, thank you for that on those two. Let's move on to the next part of this. So we're still on Northern Rock here, the last bit. Does the panel agree that the government took too long to decide about Northern Rock? We've touched a bit on that. The Tories offered no alternative policy and they've just played politics with the issue. Well, here is The Spectator's political editor, Fraser Nelson.
Well, of course, this is a huge political issue. I mean, the Conservatives want to make this Gordon Brown's Black Wednesday and hang Northern Rock like a kind of pendant of kryptonite around this kind of political Superman that he likes himself to be, you know. So, sure, this is the most political issue we've had in, probably in 10 years. But the question is, I don't really see how it could be anything other than that. I mean, because Northern Rock, I mean, it's a huge bank. It would have gone bust if we hadn't gone in to nationalise it. It would have been in the news, I think, no matter whether it was part of this great big political scrum or not.
All right, well, let's hear what you both think about this. Oliver, I mean, have the Conservatives done enough?
Well, they have proposed a Chapter 11 analogy, really, like the Americans are dealing with their failing companies over their struggling companies. It's unfair to say that they haven't proposed any solutions. And on the significance of the particular issue, it's very hard to overestimate it if you put 110 billion on the government's books.
But there is a question which is asked quite often, is whether the Conservatives are just attacking rather than actually coming up with a sensible approach. I mean, the Conservatives didn't disagree with going in the first place in order to stop those images of the run on the bank.
And it was probably right to agree with that, because you can't really accept the pictures of people queuing outside Northern Rock branches if you don't want to damage the whole economy, because it could have spread from there. So it was right to have a cross-party consensus on that. That's something needed to be done at the time. But the government's handling in the following 5 months was poor, and I think it was right of the Conservatives to point out that there were alternatives to nationalisation.
OK, Bob, a quick comment on this before we move on to the next
Well,
subject.
on the Black Wednesday thing, I think the whole thing is entirely ridiculous to suggest it's sort of Gordon Brown's Black Wednesday. Those of us who remember it, remember that people lost their homes in Black Wednesday. Loads of people lost their jobs. Interest rates went up to 15% from, I think it was 8% in one day. Northern Rock still has the potential to be very, very damaging for the government. It still has the potential to ruin Gordon Brown's reputation, but the claim it has at the moment is just nonsense to anyone who was around at the time of Black Wednesday.
OK, well, let's move on from Northern Rock now, which obviously dominated Question Time with the programme being based in Newcastle. Quite interesting as to whether that affected the debate or not. Partisan audience, whether it made it difficult for people to say what they thought. Let's move on to the next question. Now, this, of course, it's about the death penalty, and this is specifically coming on from calls from two of the families in particular of the 5 families affected by the Steve Wright convictions, the 5 women who were murdered in Ipswich. He was convicted today, of course. So the question specifically was, should we reintroduce the death penalty for multiple murder cases? Here's Fraser Nelson again from The Spectator.
In this country, we haven't had it for 50, 60 years now. I think that's pretty much a settled will of this country, because we know miscarriages of justice can happen. And I think that certainly, as you were saying, sir, that what we should do is actually make life to mean life, to actually bring back some kind of punishment where they will not get out. And Ronnie Biggs is still in prison right now. It's amazing. We have a great train robber there. We've got all sorts of people getting let out of prison for far worse crimes. So what we need to do is have a punishment system in this country that works properly, and use that and not return to the death penalty.
Well, Jeff from Eastbourne, the punishment should fit the crime, so in the case of multiple murders, the criminal should be sentenced to death. Oliver.
Well, if you believe that human life has dignity, and if you think that human life needs protection, then you can't really simultaneously argue for capital punishment. But I think there's a separate aspect. We have a role in the world to teach countries about human rights, and we simply cannot go to places like China, for example, and lecturing them on human rights if we reintroduce the death penalty on our own soil.
OK, well, Marie from Hereford, no murderer should walk free ever again, Bob.
Walking free is different from killing them, and the great problem with the death penalty is that you can never guarantee you're going to get it 100% right. The Birmingham 6 would have been hung if we had the death penalty. They turned out to be innocent.
Well, Bob from Aberdeen says, death penalty, Birmingham 6, Guildford 4, say no more.
Exactly. Makes a point. The state should be better than the criminal, not on the level of the criminal.
There's an interesting comment here from Brompton and Bairstead. If life sentences meant just that, no debate would be required. Oliver.
That's probably true, because lots of people have the impression that our legal system is too lenient on these perpetrators. And if you can murder someone and go away after 5 or 6 or 7 years, then yes, of course I can understand that people are rightly outraged.
OK, there are quite a few people making that same point. Life should mean life, David from Gateshead, for example. A lot of messages on this, but we're going to move on to the final subject, which is about rendition. So this is, why has it taken the government so many years to tell us that extraordinary rendition flights did land on British soil? These are the flights the Americans had around the world, slightly murky way, where they were alleged to be taking people, terror suspects, for torture in dark corners of the world. Vincent Cable here, Deputy Leader of the Liberal Democrats.
It's very difficult to see how this could have happened. I mean, it didn't sort of slip through. Somebody forgot to file a paper. I mean, the Americans were required to ask the British government for permission, and the British government had to give it. So I suspect there's an awful lot more to this. And I think we just need to remind ourselves why this is wrong. I mean, it's not only completely contrary to international law, but many of these people, I mean, some of them may well have terrorist connections, many of them have none at all, are being shipped to Guantanamo Bay, others are being sent to jurisdictions where they can be tortured. And this has certainly happened, and it's happened on British soil, and it is completely wrong.
OK, gentlemen, we'll just touch on this fairly briefly, as we're almost out of time. But Henry Root from Clydebank says, I've no problem with the flights stopping here. Happy to help, in fact. Oliver.
Well, it's simply against our law. It's against international law. And we have to play by the rules. And the real scandal is that we were not properly informed by the US government about what's going on.
And yet, Bob, does it matter? They were terror suspects, Dave from Bristol.
They were suspects. That doesn't give people the right to torture them, doesn't give people the right to kidnap them, doesn't give the Americans the right to break our law. It's completely unacceptable. It's completely unacceptable that the government, A, allowed it, or B, didn't know.
There's also an issue of our relationship with the US in a number of these comments. I mean, Oliver, Alan from Kent, do we really believe the Americans asked permission?
Well, it's a very good question. What can you believe? The Americans say it was an innocent mistake. Well, I think we need a proper investigation to find out what really happened.
The government, British government not telling the truth? Surely not. Chris from Stevenage. Just a quick few of the others here. I mean, Carol from Berkshire says the government probably lost the flight details with all other lost data. All right, gentlemen, that's it for tonight. Thank you very much indeed, both of you, for going through your emails and texts, which our guests get at the last moment. In fact, they get when I tell them. So thanks very much indeed, both of you. That's it on Question Time Extra this week.